Thank you very much, Pam, for those kind words, and many congratulations to Rebecca on her taking over as director of the school as well. As the title of my talk indicates, it's a pretty ambitious claim to be talking about the story of Lakonia between roughly 6000 and 1600 BC. A back of the envelope calculation suggests to me that I've got about 1 minute per 100 years. So I'm really going to have to just concentrate on some aspects of the subject. The other thing I should say is that once I start talking about Kouphovouno, I can get seriously carried away. There's an expression in English that some of you may know about talking the hind legs off a donkey, and there's a real danger that I might get too carried away, but I'll try and restrict myself to my script, as it were. I'm going to concentrate on Kouphovouno, but it is important to stress that there's much other important work being carried out, in particular by our Greek colleagues in the local ephoria, in the underwater and cave ephorias, as well as in the foreign schools. And the fact that I'll mention them, if at all, only in passing, is no reflection of the importance of the other work that's contributing to our understanding of this theme. The Kouphovouno project is an international one. It involved Chris Mee from the University of Liverpool, myself from Nottingham, and Josette Renard from France. It has worked extremely well. Ours has been a very cordial entente. It's particularly sad that Chris left us a fair number of years ago now. This photograph shows him in front of some obscure site in Athens rather than in front of Kouphovouno, where I should be showing him. But Chris is sorely missed. For the project, we're extremely grateful for the many organizations that help finance it and make it happen. A mosaic of contributors who have helped to make it happen. And also there are very many participants, colleagues, experts, students from the UK and from France and from other countries as well. And I'll just sort of scan through very quickly a rolling credits just to emphasize how many people have helped us in this effort. And here we see some of the collaborators at work, Sarah Morton and friends, working on the Middle Bronze Age cemetery that I'll be saying something about at the end of the lecture. And here we see Tom Laughlin, Chloe Duckworth, and Dan Boatwright. We don't normally consume bubbly on the site, but this was a special occasion. They were celebrating the finishing of the deep sounding in Area C. And at the very bottom of that deep sounding, you can see Chloe hard at work. But let me start by saying something about the location of the site. Kouphovouno lies just to the south of Sparta. This is an overall map of Greece showing the Peloponnese and the location of Kouphovouno here. In the second map, we see Sparta and Kouphovouno just a bit to the south. It lies between the two great massifs, which outline the central furrow of Lakonia, Taigatos to the west, and Parnon to the east. And here we see a view over the site. It's a low dome shape, artificial tell site, an accumulation of archaeological deposits over many hundreds of years. And you can see the snow-capped peaks of Taigatos in the background. The site was investigated by a survey looking over the whole area of the archaeological remains, and then by a series of excavations. These are the various areas of excavation indicated here. And also on this plan is the approximate location of excavations which were carried out in the Second World War by the German archaeologist von Vakano. And those are where we estimate his trenches to have been, and the graves that he found. There is a broader context to the establishment of Kouphovouno. I mentioned the deep sounding earlier on, and the earliest levels we discovered there were dated by radiocarbon dating to approximately 5,800 BC. And during the 6,000s and early 5,000s, we see the peopling of Europe by a massive movement of population across, probably concentrating initially in Greece itself, around 6,600, 6,500 BC, perhaps a little earlier than that, including sites such as Knossos on the island of Crete, Frankthi here, and various sites up in the north, such as Palliambala in Macedonia. And then from this central core, it looks as though streams of people moved out into Central Europe and into the Mediterranean. So Kouphovouno is part of this much larger story. And it gives us an insight into what these early farming communities were like. So here we see a plan of the settlement, probably somewhere around the middle of the sixth millennium BC, around 5,500 BC or thereabouts. And you can see that it consists of a series of buildings with passageways leading between them and large open areas in between. The buildings themselves are rather small in size. The footprint of these are of the order of 5 square meters. They're room size rather than house size. And this stands rather in contrast to the sorts of houses that are found elsewhere to the north in Greece, where the Neolithic is perhaps rather better known, where houses tend to be of 20 or even up to 50 square meters in size. The northern houses are often seen as a focus for what we might call the nuclear family, in some sense, a group of people of that sort. And the different pattern of social space, the smaller room-like units clustered around courtyards, indicates a different articulation of social space, what is public and what is private. And this pattern in southern Greece, we would suggest, is different on the basis of Kouphovouno from elsewhere to the north. There is a cultural difference between the two areas that had developed and slowly evolved over time. here's an overview looking at much the same areas we saw on the plan a moment ago, the building C1 here and the others nearby, the open area here. Through the excavations, we were able to throw light on the activities that went on in this Neolithic community. Here we see a small oven and a quern, a grinding stone, and other what seem to be cooking facilities placed in the open courtyards, indicating that these sorts of activities had a communal aspect. They were in the more open areas, though also inside the houses as well. And here we see some of the typical Middle Neolithic vases, a great pedestal bowl here, and carinated bowls here, left still in situ. In part of the same open area, the courtyard that we were looking at a moment ago, we found a whole series of very fine levels consisting frequently of burnt material. You can see how they've accumulated one over another, over another, over another, over another, over another. These were examined, sectioned through morphological examination, and the indication is that there was some firing activity which went on in the courtyard, and then once the firing was over, the burnt materials were leveled out, and then a bit later another happened, and then a bit later another happened. Christelle Ballou and Josette Renard, my colleagues, have argued that this is a firing area for the production of pottery. And certainly the pottery of the period is extremely fine, highly skilled in the control of firing. High temperatures were reached over 800 degrees centigrade. They were frequently elaborately decorated. It's been argued, and there's good reason for thinking this, that the pottery was produced largely by the women of the community, and these highly skilled and prized objects served to unite much of the whole Peloponnese. Very similar vases and are found in the Argolid, in sites such as Corinth and Mycenae and Nemea, and in the Western Peloponnese, and of course, in Lakonia as well. There were other highly skilled activities. The production of these polished stone axes, a commonplace throughout the Neolithic, nevertheless uses stones that were clearly prized for their appearance, although they were used no doubt for practical purposes, for felling trees and carpentry and the other sorts of skills that were carried out by the people of this community. They must have taken hours of work in smoothing and polishing the finished surface. Other skills that were carried out in the site, small ornaments of shell and stone were produced. This rather pretty what appears to be a representation of an animal. I think it's a bit like a bear, but my wife disagrees and says we haven't shown it quite the right way round. But it's a pendant work from mother of pearl, if you like, and the material was brought into the settlement from the sea. And there are these fine stone and shell beads that were also produced on site as well as imported from elsewhere. Other more exotic materials include flints. This is examples of what's called honey flint in English. The precise source is uncertain, but it was certainly imported from elsewhere. There is also radiolurite, this reddish material, sometimes called jasper. There are outcrops not too far, but it was certainly brought in from some distance. And obsidian coming from has argued that there were in fact traveling craftsmen who moved from community to community, who were skilled in producing these highly finished and elaborately worked artifacts. These are from Middle Neolithic contexts. There are also indications of other skills carried out. The bone tools probably are associated with leatherworking. And here we have what seems to be a spindle whorl, though it's not absolutely certain that wool was spun at this time. And also this object, which appears to be a weaving tablet. This is an unexpected find. It occurs very much earlier than similar finds elsewhere, but it does seem to fit the bill for some sort of weaving operation carried out on the site. Our experts have also looked closely at the animal products, the sorts of animal stock that serve to support the community. As frequently in settlements of this time, we find that sheep predominate, the sheep and goats predominate the period, in the Middle Neolithic and in the Late Neolithic, followed by pigs and cattle, and finally dogs. And you'll notice that the distribution of these animals is somewhat similar in both Middle Neolithic and in the following Late Neolithic periods. The picture shows a retired academic taking his goats for a walk. Also, our team of experts have looked into the seed remains of the period. Again, there's a variety of the domesticated cereals that form the basis of life at this time. It's noteworthy that free threshing wheat was particularly common at Kouphovouno. In this respect, the site is fairly unusual for the Greek Neolithic, and it serves to, in fact, to link Kouphovouno with the site of Knossos to the south. And some revolutionary work, scientific work, has been carried out on these crops, looking at the isotopes of carbon and of nitrogen. And the results of these analyses have been to show that the free threshing wheat has very high nitrogen concentrations, whereas the hulled barley is much lower. You can see how the two are quite distinct on this graph. The y-axis indicates the nitrogen concentrations. From this, the experts who have looked at this, Petra Weiglova and Amy Bogard led the project, have been able to confirm that there were the practice of agriculture saw highly intensive exploitation. It's almost a sort of farming that's more like market gardening than like the extensive ploughed fields that we think of today. Paul Holstead had long argued for this type of farming at the time, and here we have scientific evidence using the very latest scientific results which support his model of highly intensive agriculture that is closely integrated with animal remains. The manuring that's indicated by high nitrogen concentrations are derived from the integration of the animals and the plants of this time, whereas the hulled barley seems to indicate perhaps an outfield system, one that's less intensively cultivated. Again, interestingly, these results show a link between the Middle Neolithic and the Late Neolithic. And though there are subtle differences between the two, Middle Neolithic sheep are looking slightly different on the graph in terms of carbon-13, which has something to do with the watering of the fields. In the Late Neolithic, there's a slightly different distribution. But overall, the agricultural economy between the two periods seems to be very similar. So in looking at this early stage, I'd like to finish with a quotation from one of my favorite archaeologists, Catherine Perles, the great doyenne of Neolithic, of the early Neolithic period. And she points out that early Neolithic societies, as we've seen from the Kouphovouno remains, were complex societies that had created a completely anthropogenic environment, solved the problem of cohabitation and competition in densely settled areas, and succeeded in sustaining long-distance trade over more than a millennium. Yet they achieved this without having recourse to institutionalized hierarchy or control. Around 5,400 BC or thereabouts, there is a radical change at our site. The settled area seems to shrink. This came out partly from the original extensive survey of the site. We see distributions of the Middle Neolithic and the Late Neolithic, and you can see those distribution maps are rather different. Note this concentration up here, rather thinner here. And this seemed to be confirmed by the excavation, where these areas to the left, that's to say to the west of the site, were settled in the Middle Neolithic, but not in the Late Neolithic. There appears to be something of a radical change in the appearance of the site around this time. And that radical change is echoed more widely in Lakonia. For example, whilst in the Middle Neolithic, we would have very few dots on this map, in the Late Neolithic period, there seems to be a much wider spread of population over the settled area. And there is also a radical change in the material culture, in the pottery and other finds of the period. Here we see new types of pottery which have been introduced to the site, blackware, greyware, matte painted, and polychrome. These at Kouphovouno have appeared very early on in the late Neolithic, let's say around 5,500, 5,300 BC, but also interestingly, side by side with the traditional Middle Neolithic, so-called furnace type of pottery. And you can see the remarkable contrast between the aesthetics, if you like, of these two types of pottery. There is an important change at this time. And it's a change which is very widespread throughout Greece. I mentioned that the furnace style tends to be concentrated particularly in the Peloponnese. There are links with further areas further north in Greece, but the style and forms of the pottery is distinct, and the technology as well. As far as the so-called blackware is concerned, we seem to be looking at something that links a very much larger, wider area. In this slide, we see material on the left that's been found, well, in fact, in Hungary, but part of Hungary close to Serbia, high up in the Balkans. And you can see how the shapes and the appearance of the pottery is similar. There are slight differences, but there are very close similarities. Likewise, we find in the late Neolithic these tall pedestaled vessels that called by the archaeologists fruit stands, that they probably weren't used for that. But again, the appearance is very similar. In the case of the Hungarian types, they're red, these are black, but you can see how similar they are in appearance. These very solid, fat bases occur, and wide-ranging bowls stood on these stands. So it looks as though there are links across, spreading from far north in the Balkans down into the Peloponnese at this time, and indeed these types spread across the Aegean Sea as well. And there are influences from elsewhere. Here we see a very curious type. The experts refer to them as rhytons, though that's a fairly meaningless term. They're curious. They've got animal-like legs, big hoop handles, and then a sort of hollowed out open area. Some people have suggested they might have been used for salt, but there are many competing theories. But you'll note that from the distribution map, which I've taken from Katie Fine's excellent PhD thesis, which she kindly put at my disposal, these are found spread along the Dalmatian coast, far north into the Adriatic area, and indeed in southern Italy, and as far as the Lipari Islands. Now, it's interesting that there are these two parallel introductions. The blackwares seem to come from further north in Serbia. These curious vessels penetrating into Greece seem to come from further south and west. But they're both penetrating into a Greece that at this time is showing disturbance, a change in settlement pattern, perhaps movements of people from one area to another. and it seems to have been important to the people of the time to register a shared symbolism in the types of vases that using. And no doubt these were, to a degree, a way of helping people recognize in a time of disturbance and change that there are similarities. There are ways almost of communicating through their material culture, through the vases they have. I'm very conscious that I've spent quite a lot of time talking about the period of just 800 years, roughly, of the overall span I was intending to cover. The radiocarbon dates from Kouphovouno indicate that the Neolithic occupation came to an end around 5000 BC, and the site appears to have been almost entirely deserted for a very long span of time. We find slight traces of later and final Neolithic pottery. They turn up in later deposits, so we can't ascribe them. We can only recognize them in terms of the designs on the pottery. This large gap in the chronology is what I refer to today as the donkey's reprieve. It will save me having to spend many minutes over the hundreds of years that they cover. In fact, the site is reoccupied perhaps somewhere around 3300 BC with the early Bronze Age material. Here we see some of the pottery that we can date to that phase, roughly 3300 to about 2950 on the basis of radiocarbon dates. And we're moving now into yet another major phase in the development of Lakonia, the early Bronze Age. And in the early Bronze Age, we see a much denser pattern of settlement. Pam mentioned the Lakonia survey, which was concentrated around here. And we found something like 30 sites belonging to the early Bronze Age, whereas the late Neolithic, there were just a handful of them, and we found no signs of the middle Neolithic in this part of Lakonia. So a much more intensively occupied landscape, and one that seems socially and politically to have been much more complex. As far as Kouphovouno is concerned, we were faced with many puzzles from this period. We found virtually no clear architectural remains in the sense of walls from houses or floors from houses, or the sorts of finds that are really extremely common and normally found on early Bronze Age sites. Our main source of information were early rubble-filled pits. We see a couple of examples found from area G, one over here and one over here. There's a balk separating the two parts of this feature. This is a view from on top. You can see that the pits were filled with a mass of stone and rubble, as well as artifacts. And this is part of the section of the shallower end of the pits. They reach up to about 1 meter in depth and frequently of the order of 3 meters or so across. So these were puzzling features, puzzling in the sense that they seem to have been dug and then almost immediately refilled. There's no sign of secondary accumulation of soil at the bottom of the pits. But they contain materials indicating everything we'd expect from an early Bronze Age site. We find the whole range of pottery, these types of decorated pots decorated with little triangular impressions. We find an absolutely classic form of pottery of the early Bronze Age, a so-called sauce boat, saucers, so-called saucers of this sort, storage vessels, things like these large storage jars, and the whole gamut of pottery that we would expect of this period. So although these are occurring in these in the filled pits, they plainly indicate that a flourishing early Bronze Age community existed on the site. We could find very few parallels to this custom of cutting pits and then strangely just dumping material from one particular period. It's worth mentioning that each of these pits is very distinct in its pottery assemblage, and we can distinguish between one period and another from one to another. Recently, however, a site has been excavated by the Greek Archaeological Service to the north of Greece, a site at a location called Kiparisi, where they seem to have found the same sort of thing. In an area which was otherwise unoccupied, there are reported pits containing early Bronze Age material of this sort. The finds included not only pottery, but also other indications of that there were houses in the vicinity. Here we see a decorated hearth. This is the fragment. You can see it has a base here and a raised side, and then impressed decoration around the edge. These hearths have been found quite widely in Greece, famously at the site of Lerna, where highly decorated examples were found, but at other sites in the islands as well, on the island of Kea and elsewhere. As far as Lakonia is concerned, they're found at Kouphovouno and at Pavlopetri, a site we'll be talking about later on in the series. But I think none have been reported so far elsewhere. But these were large, monumental, keyhole-shaped objects which would have stood at the center of a room and marked an area around which people gathered around the burning fire that would have kept the building warm in winter. We find material that is types of finds that are again quite common elsewhere. Although this is fragmentary, it's part of an ox figurine of types that have been found widely throughout Greece at this time, underlining the links between Lakonia and the rest of mainland Greece, and indeed the islands, and with Crete as well during this flourishing period. There are other more puzzling finds. These slate objects seem to have had double borings. There's one here, and it's broken where the second boring was found. A somewhat similar, but even more fragmentary piece from another part of the site. And similar things have been found at other early Bronze Age sites in Lakonia, such as Anthokori, not far from Kouphovouno. We're really not sure what they were used for. One possibility is that they may have been used as loom weights. There is a form of loom weight with a double boring that was sometimes called crescentic weights that have been found elsewhere. But elsewhere, these are normally of clay and tend to have the holes at the tips rather than lower down. So possibly some form of sophisticated weaving was going on at Kouphovouno at this time, though these are not quite like the examples that have been found, for example, at the site of Tiryns and elsewhere. So the whole gamut of activities were found, have been discovered at Kouphovouno, though there are still many questions and uncertainties in our interpretation of those finds, in getting a full understanding of what happened during this period, this major period in the development of Lakonia. The early Bronze settlements seem to have come to an end sometime around 2600, 2500 BC. There's another hiatus, it would appear, in the use of the site. This is not entirely unparalleled elsewhere in Lakonia. Many sites seem to come to an end at some stage during what's called the early Bronze II period, if you like, somewhere around 2500, 2300 BC. Those sites come to an end at slightly different periods. The important site at Hierarchy that we'll be visiting on the tour of Lakonia, excavated by our colleagues from the Dutch school, Joost Kroll and Mieke Prent, seems to continue a little longer than Kouphovouno, but it too comes to an end, and there seems to be something of a break of occupation, with only a few sites producing material that can be dated towards the very end of the third millennium, the very late 2000s BC. At Kouphovouno, things pick up again somewhere around 2100 or thereabouts BC. But now we have evidence not for settlement, but for a cemetery. And this shows the location of many of the burials of this period. They stretched over quite a wide area, and indeed the cemetery is probably even more extensive. Such graves were found by von Vacano in the 1940s, and you can see that they're quite widely distributed here. Our survey results indicate that these later Bronze Age sites may well have concentrated in the northeastern sector and the eastern part of the site, so that the cemetery may be associated with a settlement that's a little distance away. This shows the distribution of Middle Bronze Age, the period we're talking about now, and indeed Late Bronze Age pottery from the surface survey. Here we see some of the remains. Most of the graves are simply in earth-cut pits. This, more unusually, is in a cis grave, the grave of a male, teenager, shown crouched within a grave consisting of upright slabs. Children were also buried in the cemetery. Here we have a little one of just 3 to 5 years old, placed in a simple pit grave. Most of the graves had no offerings at all in them. A few of them had remains of a pot or a little, there are these little spindle whorls that are characteristic of and accompany many Middle Bronze Age burials throughout Greece at this time. The pottery is of standard types, again, found widely within Greece. This shows a few scattered remains of what we refer to as a second or secondary burial. What happened was that the bones were exhumed of an earlier burial and then reburied. This one is interesting because its radiocarbon date belongs fairly early, before 2000 BC, and yet the bones were placed above a grave which has radiocarbon dates much later, so that it looks as though they uncovered, perhaps they thought this burial belonged to a more recent ancestor, but for whatever reason they re-exhumed it and placed it in a burial setting. Another puzzle concerning these graves was the matrix into which they were set. They were cut into what appeared to be earlier deposits. Indeed, when we first excavated these graves, we thought they were of much earlier date, of late Neolithic date, because the pottery from the surrounding soil was all of late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, not Middle Bronze Age. And it was only after we got radiocarbon dates that we realized that these belong to a much later period. This excavating and re-excavating of earlier material puzzled us to a degree, though on reflection there are parallels elsewhere. I might mention, for example, a site near Pylos called Vidokilia, which has early Bronze Age settlement, like our early Bronze Age settlement. And then in the Middle Bronze Age, it's used largely for burials. And these burials sometimes reuse the earlier material, pile it up into mounds, and indeed, ultimately, a small tholos tomb, a small built tomb, was constructed within it. And recent excavations at the site of Aios Vasilios, a little bit to the south of here, important for its late Bronze Age palatial constructions, but there is a Middle Bronze Age cemetery there. And there too, there are accumulations of stone and soil into which the burials are set. So this helps us understand what's going on in Kouphovouno during the Middle Bronze Age. It has to be said that the analysis of the bones has revealed not a terribly healthy population. There are indications that the people were of this settlement were of low stature, low height in comparison with other Middle Bronze Age sites. They were of poor health, and alas, it appears that they were not very good at cleaning their teeth. One particular grave is this one, grave 213. It's the burial of a male, again a teenager, 16 to 17 years old. But the odd thing about this grave is that the skeleton was cut in two. This is the upper part of the skeleton. You can see the spine here, and these are the legs. And rather than being placed one on top of the other, they're placed side by side. The skeleton has been cut through at the level of the pelvis. This is an odd occurrence. The burial itself was accompanied by a bronze spearhead, presumably indicating that this was a warrior. And so I think we have here the burial of war dead, an unusual occurrence. There are not many examples we can point to. And whilst throughout this talk, I've tried to emphasize the scientific results, but finds do have an emotional impact as well. And it strikes me that the discovery of the grave of little more than a boy as war dead finds its echoes today with the finds from Ukraine, and echoes through the centuries, the way in which I suppose old men have abused the young in warfare. That cemetery comes to an end somewhere around 1600 BC. That's roughly the date of this spearhead. Examples like this are found in the shaft graves and elsewhere in Mycenae. But the settlement continues. We found late Bronze Age finds, rather sparse in terms of the excavation, but as you saw in the survey remains, it looks as though the site clustered in another part of the hill. So at the start of the project, we expected a long and continuous sequence of occupation. Thanks to excavation, a very different picture has emerged. Certainly periods of continuity, Middle Bronze Age, the late Neolithic, or the early Bronze Age, but these are interrupted by severe discontinuities. We have important new insights thanks to archaeological science. I've mentioned the isotope studies by Petra Weiglova and Amy Bogard, thin section analysis by Christelle Ballou, skeletal analysis by Anna Laya, and so I could go on. There are many experts who have contributed, but thanks to the collaboration of these many scholars, new chapters have been written of Lakonian prehistory, a story that moved from egalitarian societies of the Neolithic to more hierarchical forms, though these terms oversimplify the rich and varied histories of Lakonia's past. Thank you.